here to begin with, as it says, as Shantideva says in his guide to the Bodhisattva's way of life, this life of leisures and endowments is extremely difficult to find. And this is something that can be used to our benefit. So we shouldn't, while we have this kind of opportunity, let it go to waste, but instead make use of this precious kind of opportunity. So here we have met with the Dharmas, with the teachings of the Buddha, which is extremely rare. Most of the ages, the eons in the world are dark ages where we don't have the kind of teachings from the Buddha. But we are fortunate enough not only to have met with the teachings of the Buddha, they still remain, and we are able to, having all of the kind of conducive conditions, put ourselves to practice. And so here, while we have this kind of situation of freedom, of all of the opportunities to be able to practice, we should take advantage of this. And this life that we have right now is so extremely rare because of the fact that it took all of these causes coming together for us to be able to take such a rebirth. So we should reflect in this way about how extremely rare and fortunate it is to have such a situation. So here, while we have this kind of rebirth, we have the ability to practice the precious Dharma. If we are, say, born as an animal, we don't have that kind of ability. Or if we're born in a really remote location or without the proper kinds of faculties, even if we had if we had been born in this world, there are many situations where we aren't able to practice the Dharma. But this time, this life that we have right now is something that is extremely short. When we look at the future, the kind of good and bad, the things that we have to experience in our future lives, this is a much longer amount of time. And so we should use, at the very least, as this verse continues, it says we should use this kind of life for the benefit of beings. This is the kind of opportunity we have right now. And so we, at the very least, should be striving to gain a good, a fortunate rebirth in the future. But recognizing that even if we are to take a rebirth as a human or a god, avoiding the kind of lower realms, it's still within the realms of samsara. It's still in the nature of suffering. So striving to get beyond that, we want to reach a kind of stable, lasting happiness, one in which we don't have to cast off and take up aggregates under the control of karma and the afflictions. So thinking beyond just taking the future rebirth in a good kind of situation, one strives for a stable, lasting happiness. But yet again, looking at other sentient beings, one realizes that it's not good enough to just strive for one's own aim alone, but rather one wants to strive for that state in which one is able to benefit all sentient beings. And so with this kind of recognition that the life we have right now, we can use this for the aims of beings, but if we don't use this to our benefit, use it to our advantage, then how will we have this again in the future? We have to start by having another good rebirth in order to continue to try to accumulate those kinds of causes of liberation and omniscience. And so thinking of the precious opportunity that we have right now and wanting to create all of those sorts of causes, we should think, I'm striving to attain that state in which I am able to truly fully benefit other sentient beings, striving for that state of Buddhahood, and I will do whatever is necessary in order to get to that place, taking advantage of this life that I have right now. So, thinking in this way, we should reflect that we have taken up this life right now due to accumulating the particular causes and conditions. We have this sort of human life, but we have in the past taken countless rebirths as good in good states of existence and bad states of existence. There are countless previous lives, and so too, when it comes to our future lives, we are looking at a very long period of time of continuing to take up and experience future lives. So now normally we need to reflect in this way about past and future lives because our normal sense of like what it is to be a human, we think human on the basis of looking at someone's aggregates, looking at someone's body. And that's not the thing that is going to travel into a future life. That body will, while it acts as a support for the mind in this life, it isn't going to continue. Rather, it's that very very, very subtle mental consciousness that is going to continue into future lives. So right now, on the basis of these particular aggregates, we experience human feelings and human discernment and all of those things. But when the appearances of this life fade away, when those set and we continue into our next life, we will then, that extremely subtle mind will take up another rebirth. And so the idea of a human life, we often have this idea of like a solid thing based upon this body, but we need to reflect upon that very subtle mind, that kind of component that is going to continue into our future lives. Like we can think, take the example of like being, having a surgery done or something, wherein one is put to sleep, is anesthetized such that you don't have those kinds of coarse feelings, but there still is that extremely subtle mind, and that subtle mind has as its basis this very subtle wind, and those will then continue into future lives. So here I'm thinking about the kind of nature of we are impermanent, momentary, changing moment to moment, and we have since beginningless time been taking up rebirths, and we will into the future have to continue to take these rebirths so long as we have not abandoned the root of that. And so thinking in this way, we give rise to the sense of really wanting to get out of this cycle, of wanting to attain a kind of liberation. But we turn and we recognize it's not just me, it's not just myself that is in this kind of situation, but it's all other sentient beings. And now countless Buddhas have come in the past. They have given teachings, but yet still we remain here. We still have to work on training our mind. And this begins, again, by not thinking about us and them, not making those kinds of distinctions, but instead trying to, again, work for all sentient beings based upon seeing just that the fact that they are beings from that very point, not needing to have some sort of special connection with them, but recognizing that all beings, we should abandon harming them and strive to benefit them as much as we are able to, simply due to the fact that they are sentient beings. And in this way, we can come to develop this sort of attitude that we are striving not only to free ourselves from this kind of suffering situation, but all sentient beings, and in that way strive to benefit all beings. So here we need to have a very kind of vast way of thinking. When we get into in mind training, it talks about having a long-term kind of view of thinking long-term, because Buddhahood is not something that comes about quickly, but rather takes many countless eons in order to attain that sort of state. We need to have that sort of mental fortitude or this kind of vast aspiration that says, no matter how long it takes, I'm going to strive to attain that state of Buddhahood. So when we have a being like a hearer, a Shravaka, they only have the kind of mental fortitude. They want to attain liberation, enlightenment quickly. So they want to be able to do this within 2 or 3 lives. A solitary realizer has a little bit more fortitude in that they are able to progress over a longer period of time. But when it comes to bodhisattvas, they are committing to benefit others and attain that state in which they are most fully able to benefit others, no matter how long it may take. It's not as though they are sitting there like waiting for something to come about, though. The idea of training over 3 countless eons is something that they do joyfully. It's not like thinking, well, when is this going to be over? But rather, this thought of wishing to benefit others and being able to do that is the question of how long it is going to take to get to enlightenment is irrelevant. That thought of benefiting others is so strong that it doesn't really matter how long it may take. It's said that bodhisattvas actually give rise to that kind of thought of, may everyone else become enlightened and then I follow with that, or may we become enlightened together. So this sort of attitude, when we really have this in a genuine way, it doesn't matter how long it will take, so long as one is striving for the sake of others. Bodhisattvas bodhisattvas engage joyfully. They engage with this kind of enthusiasm with no thought of like, okay, when is this over? But so we need to develop this kind of attitude when we are working on training our minds that this isn't going to happen immediately. We can't expect a result just right in this one lifetime, but rather have this sort of fortitude that says, no matter how long it takes, I'm going to strive to this state of Buddhahood, a state in which I've developed all good qualities and removed all faults, and thereby have the greatest potential to be able to benefit other sentient beings. And so, if we condense all of the kinds of teachings of the Buddha into two main points, it is abandoning harming others and working to benefit them. Really, abandoning harm being that trying to get rid of their suffering, that attitude of compassion, and that wish to benefit being the sort of love of wanting other beings to have happiness. And so, in this way, all practices are really that bodhisattvas engage in are both directly or indirectly to abandon harming others, to relieve their suffering, and to bring about their happiness. And so, this again is something where we should think that we are striving long term. We are trying to train our minds in such a way that we're not thinking about just getting something in this life, but rather we should make this kind of decision. I am going to continue to train my mind, no matter how long it takes, in order to get to that kind of state of Buddhahood, not expecting the result to be immediate. So, some people might think that, well, I'm striving for this state of Buddhahood in order to then be able to help other sentient beings. When I get to Buddhahood, then I'll be helping others. But really, this is not the right way of thinking, because Buddhahood is the culmination of the perfection of being able to help others most fully. But it is along the way, what we are doing is benefiting and helping others. We are training in that. So, along the way to that state of enlightenment, one is making effort constantly at working for the benefit of others. So, while Buddhahood is sort of the culmination, the perfection of that development of one's ability to work for the benefit of others, really all along the way, one is striving to help others and is improving in order to eventually sort of culminate, perfect that state. So, here one should make this kind of decision. Again, recognizing that we are still at the point of training, we can still make this kind of decision that we're going to, from the depths of our hearts, strive to get to that point, to be able to develop those qualities all the way to the best of our ability. And so here, it's like when a child maybe is still first learning how to read, they don't know all of the letters yet, they don't know the language, but they can think like, oh, I want to become this really powerful person or be able to do this in the future. They're holding that goal, even though right now they're still learning kind of the language and how to actually read, for example. So, like that, we should recognize that although Buddhahood is the perfection of benefiting others, what we are doing is improving and striving in that in all of our actions until that goal. So, with that kind of thinking, we should set a good motivation for listening to these teachings, thinking that we are listening to this Dharma in order to be able to attain that state of perfect, complete enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. So here, then, as for the Dharma that we are going to be discussing today, as requested by Shravasti Abbey, I will be teaching on the Arya Rice Seedling Sutra as taught by the Buddha. So here, this is mainly teaching dependent origination, how it is that we go about attaining these higher paths through an understanding of dependent origination and removing our obscurations through that. So here, as for the kind of origin of this commentary, there was a time when I translated the commentary by Kamala Shila into Hindi, and then at that time I made a sort of introduction to that. So here we will be going through then this teaching on the Rice Seedling Sutra. So here, as far as this sutra of the Rice Seedling Sutra, this takes as a basis, this again in English, it's quite clear, the rice seedling, a sprout of a rice. And he said that based upon using this as an example, the Buddha says, monks, he who sees dependent arising sees the Dharma, and he who sees the Dharma sees the Buddha. So that's sort of the basis of this, is that whoever sees dependent origination is able to see the Dharma or realize the Dharma. So it is based upon understanding dependent origination, these teachings on dependent origination, how phenomena arise through causes and conditions, that disciples are able to see the Dharma, realize the Dharma. It's actually through the teaching of dependent origination that one is able to see as well the kind of various qualities of impermanence and suffering, selflessness and emptiness, and so forth, by way of understanding dependent origination in terms of how it is that samsara comes into effect and how it is that then one is able to reverse samsara as well. This, again, is by this understanding of dependent origination, this sort of arising due to causes and conditions and so forth, as well as the kind of other things that are linked with that, including things like the Eightfold Noble Path that also are sort of linked to this teaching of dependent origination. So again, the basic beginning of this sutra is that the Buddha teaches that says, monks, whoever sees dependent origination sees the Dharma. And based upon that, seeing the Dharma, understanding that in this way, he says, he who sees the Dharma sees the Buddha. So based upon having an understanding of the Dharma that the Buddha taught, one can also have a realization of the particular qualities of the Buddha. So here then, dependent origination is considered extremely important as a teaching. Through dependent origination, we can establish that things are impermanent, that they depend upon various causes and conditions, and they can establish that we don't have this kind of autonomous existence in the way that things appear to us. Rather, it's based upon the kind of aggregation of causes and conditions that things come about. So here we will see later in the text how this refutes the idea of some kind of a creator God or things needing to be propelled by some sort of motivation. It's not as though the sprout comes into existence because of thinking, oh, I want to come into existence, for example. So here, this sort of, we will get into it in the sutra, but it is establishing that once, if you have all of the causes and conditions present, then something will come into being. But one can't assert that there's some sort of like things being moved by intention or something like that. So it is through establishing, and this can establish all four of these, impermanence, suffering, selflessness, and emptiness can be established through a proper understanding of dependent origination. It's also able to remove all of the kind of wrong conceptions that we might have and establish a proper kind of understanding. So here, as it says in the beginning of Je-Lama Tsongkhapa's In Praise of Dependent Origination, he praises the Buddha saying, I bow down to the unsurpassable teacher and sage, the one who sees and knows dependent arising, the king of reasons, and explains it just as he sees it. So here, and later in the text, Tsongkhapa is praising the Buddha for his teaching on dependent origination, saying that, this is the unsurpassed kind of teaching. This is the unsurpassed knowledge. The knowledge of dependent origination is supreme among wisdoms. And so when we begin to understand the nature of that, we see that it's not just an understanding of things being dependent upon causes and conditions. That's sort of a more coarse level of understanding, but also that all things are empty of this kind of autonomous existence. And again, because we are under the control of such causes and conditions, we are in this kind of suffering situation. So again, this reasoning of dependent origination can establish all of these various points. So when like we look at all of the kind of elements of the method side as well of the path, these can also be established through dependent origination. We can see how it is that love and compassion, for example, are efficacious because of that understanding of causality. So here, whatever it is that comes about due to causes and conditions. But not only that, things are dependently originated in the sense that they are dependent upon their various parts. They're dependent upon their basis of designation. And so, because things are dependently originated, they are therefore empty of any kind of intrinsic existence. Again, this is not an understanding of dependent origination that is solely causality, but it goes beyond that. And this continues then into the second verse, where it says, ignorance is the root of all the manifold misery in the world. So he teaches dependent arising, the seeing of which reverses it. So, all the source of all of our various problems, both in this life and in our future lives, we can see how this kind of happens with respect to our ignorance. Due to ignorance, we create all of our problems. Our lack of understanding is what brings about all of the various sufferings that we experience. Like Shantideva has said to us, it is the case that we think we are getting our happiness. What we are running after is what we think is happiness, but we're actually running toward our own suffering. We see this with ourselves as an individual, with states, with groups, with parties, all of these kinds of things. We think, oh, I'm going to get some happiness, but we're actually, running toward the causes of our suffering or creating the causes of our suffering. So if we understand this well, if we understand the kind of ignorance that is the foundation that leads to our suffering, and have a proper understanding of the presentation of dependent origination, we can see that all of the various things that exist, friend, enemy, good, bad, all of these things, we can see that they don't have some kind of existence from their own side, but rather are merely designated by mind. And so too, when it comes to the person, this idea of self or this sense of I, we have this idea of I as an autonomous kind of a being, as though we were set up from our own side, but we don't actually exist in that way. When we look at the person designated on these five aggregates or on the basis of these six elements, we can see that there's earth and water, fire, air, space, and consciousness. And on the basis of that, we designate a person. We can talk about a person. But when we look for, well, where is that actual person? We can't point to anything. We can't identify that actual the person that as it exists in our mind. We can't, and two, when we look through all of the various aggregates, find one of those that is somehow existent in the way that it appears to us. And so all of these, the way in which this I appears to us, we can have a sense that it exists from its own side, but it doesn't actually exist. And it is through the understanding, the proper kind of understanding of dependent origination, that we are able to undo this kind of ignorance. And we will obviously get into this more as we go on. So, this understanding of dependent origination is extremely important. So, when explaining dependent origination, then it is closely linked with this idea of emptiness. Emptiness meaning that there is no kind of intrinsic existence, no autonomous existence from the side of the object. So, here in this explanation of dependent origination in the sutra, it will go through looking at the way in which our external environment is dependently originated, as well as the kind of inner dependent origination. So, this gets into negating the idea of there being some kind of other creator that brings things about, but rather this understanding of dependent origination means that there couldn't be such a creator. So here, emptiness refutes this kind of existence from its own side, existence as though it were non-contingent or non-dependent. But this is something where one shouldn't fall into a kind of misunderstanding. If you don't understand emptiness properly, someone might think that, oh, well, nothing whatsoever exists. and that kind of nihilistic view can come about. So here, as Nagarjuna has said, if someone of little wisdom sort of encounters emptiness, it can bring ruin for them in the way that like holding a poisonous snake can lead you to get bitten. So there is a kind of danger of teaching emptiness, of understanding emptiness, misunderstanding emptiness, as having this idea that there's no cause and effect, there's no karma, there's no virtuous or non-virtuous actions. And in that way, if someone who doesn't have a proper understanding, they can fall into that kind of nihilistic extreme. It can be like being bitten by a poisonous snake. So on the one hand, there's a sort of great danger in teaching emptiness to those who are not able to properly understand. But on the other hand, we have quotations from Aryadeva's 400 verses, where he explains that even by having just a little bit of doubt, if we start to doubt the way that things are, this can begin to dismantle samsara completely. If we have this normal idea of I and that sense of I and grasping to that I, if we are able to begin to just have a little bit of doubt about the way that that exists and see that that root of samsara, if we can begin to destabilize that in some kind of a way, that's actually the beginning of being able to tear samsara down, take it apart completely. So here we should have this kind of understanding that yes, emptiness can be a very profound and dangerous almost teaching in some ways, but also it's powerful in the sense that even just a little bit of understanding can begin to really dismantle that fundamental ignorance.
Oh, yeah.
So here, then, in dependence upon realizing emptiness, it is for these kinds of beings who have had this realization of emptiness that all of samsara and nirvana is actually established within that understanding of emptiness. And so it is emptiness alone that is able to remove all of this kind of lack of knowledge, this nescience that we have. And it is able to develop our wisdom fully. So here, just to give a kind of brief summary of what Geshe-la has been saying, there is a quotation from a sutra in which it explains here, talking about the vast kind of benefits of realizing emptiness, that someone who is lacking in skill and means, and here this means someone who is lacking a realization of emptiness, can habituate to, can develop the practice of the six perfections over hundreds of eons, over thousands of eons. And the kind of merit that they would accumulate would be vast, would be almost immeasurable. But whoever, in contrast to that, whoever listens with even a little bit of doubt to the teachings on emptiness, if they have this thought of like, well, what is selflessness? What is emptiness? Their merit would be greater still than those other beings. So what need to speak of someone who would be listening with the kind of lack of doubt, with certainty in what they are hearing? So here, this kind of understanding of the sort of benefits and the power of emptiness, this really gets at, it is so powerful because of the fact that emptiness gets at the root of samsara. All of our suffering comes from this grasping at an I, and the attachment and the hatred and all of the various afflictions that arise from it. That is the root of all of the kind of suffering, all of the misfortune that we experience. And so in the basis, by creating that kind of realization of emptiness, that understanding of emptiness, we are getting at the very root of all of our various sufferings. It is the root too, of how we are able to develop genuine love and compassion. So there are extremely great benefits to understanding emptiness. So here there's another sutra quotation, I believe it might be from the Vajra Cutter Sutra, wherein again, it's explaining that the kind of merit that one would create, say if you were to take the number of grains of sand in the Ganges, or we could say the ocean. We're just talking about some sort of vast body of water. And imagine world systems as vast as those grains of sand. And imagine offering to the Buddhas in all of those world systems, all of the 7 royal emblems, all of those kinds of precious things. Imagine the kind of merit that would be created from that. But if one is to understand, even if they are to, say, repeat the meaning of one verse, one 4-line verse of the teachings on emptiness, such merit would be greater than such a kind of an offering. So we don't have to think of it exactly the same. We could imagine offering to all of the sort of precious beings, even within this world, and the kind of vast amount of merit that would be created. Well, just listening to one four-line verse on the meaning of emptiness, or hearing that, explaining it to someone else, that kind of merit is extensively more vast. And so here, this is the kind of, we should recognize that our understanding, our study of emptiness is something that is incredibly powerful, incredibly precious. And if we are thinking about the other sorts of benefits, it's as well explained that those kinds of negative actions that we have committed in the past, actually within the context of the five negativities of immediate retribution, as they are normally called, we could think of the example of Angulimala killing all of these people, but through his realization of emptiness, he was able to purify those kinds of negativities. So actually the Buddha has said, I speak of these five negativities of immediate retribution only in the context of not understanding emptiness, because this understanding of emptiness is so extremely powerful in terms of being able to accumulate merit and purify those extreme kind of negativities that we may have created. So, here, this kind of explanation of emptiness, we will get into it more below, but often we see these, like in Nagarjuna's fundamental verses or root verses on emptiness, or wisdom, where he talks about anything's dependent arising is explained as emptiness, looking at this intimate connection between the teaching of dependent origination and the teaching of emptiness. And we see that the Buddha, many, like the Jelama Tsongkhapa, as well as Nagarjuna, praise the Buddha in particular for his teaching on dependent origination, which eliminates any kind of idea that things exist from their own side, that they have a sort of autonomous or existence that is not contingent or dependent upon other things. So here in Nagarjuna's fundamental treatise, the praise, the homage that he offers to the Buddha says, I bow down to the most holy of teachers, the completely accomplished Buddha, who teaches the peace that pacifies all elaboration, that whatever dependently arises has no cessation, no arising, no annihilation, no permanence, no coming, no going, no unity, no plurality. And so here, praising the Buddha for teaching in this way, that things are not arisen by means of some kind of intrinsic nature, that they are not established, they are not arisen from their own side or ceased from their own side, but rather things come about due to causes and condition. We see this with a sort of increase of things and their decrease. They don't do so from their own power or from their own side, but rather it is the case that they are dependent upon the accumulation, the aggregation of various causes and conditions to come about. If it were the case that, say, something like a tree were able to be were able to arise from its own side, it wouldn't have to depend upon a seed or a sprout or any of that. It would just come into being, or it would have to be in being as a fully blown tree. And so here, this, when it comes to the kind of understanding that the Buddha has put forth, it is saying that there is no sort of cessation or arising, intrinsic cessation without dependence on some kind of causes and conditions. And so when it comes then to no annihilation and no permanence, this is looking at the way that things are not they don't cease, their continuum is not cut in a kind of intrinsic way, nor do they abide or remain in a way that is stable and intrinsic, not dependent upon other things. And so then sort of looking at this in terms of time, again, there's no coming, no going, nothing that comes about due to its own sort of force of existence, and nothing that goes away due to its own autonomous existence. And so it is dependent upon um, again, various causes and conditions coming together that we can talk about coming and going, but there is no such intrinsic coming or intrinsic going. And so, too, there's no unity or no plurality in the way that we like talk about things like a self or others or any kind of phenomena. They're either one thing or they are multiple, they are plural or different, like a pot and a pillar. So too, things do not have that kind of intrinsic existence as a singular thing or as separate or different things. So here, when Nagarjuna is praising the Buddha, the completely accomplished Buddha, the most holy of teachers, who teaches the peace that pacifies all elaboration, one could also say that all of these things, no cessation, no arising, no annihilation, no permanence, no coming, no going, no unity, no plurality, this is to the perspective of an Arya's meditative equipoise. And while there are kind of many teachers, the Buddha is the most holy of teachers, specifically for this particular teaching. So, when it comes to the teaching of emptiness and selflessness, there are different levels of sort of coarseness and subtlety, and different schools explain things slightly differently. So, we have to recall when the Buddha came to the world and gave his teachings, the sort of prevalent view among those sorts of philosophical schools at the time was that there was some kind of autonomous self, something that was permanent, something that would continue into future lives. Something like what the Samkhyas or other schools would assert is, although like our form is impermanent, there is a self that is permanent, that will continue into future lives, that is something singular as well. It's not dependent upon the aggregates, really. It can stand alone by itself. And it is something that kind of like appropriates those aggregates. And for them, this is what they identify. You can point to and you can say, yes, there is such a permanent, singular, autonomous kind of a self. And this is something that they consider would can go into future lives as kind of a permanent, stable kind of a self that would not be dependent upon the aggregates. It's separate from the aggregates. And this kind of a self is something that is not accepted by any sort of a Buddhist school. They would all accept the non-existence of such a self. But that's the most coarse kind of understanding. As we get more subtle, it gets into the idea of there not being a self that is a self-sufficient, substantially existent entity, something that could be identified as contingent upon, but apart from the aggregates. And so this kind of level of selflessness is getting more subtle. But as you continue in this kind of subtlety, there's the understanding of selflessness that is a lack of some kind of autonomous existence from its own side, as though it were able to exist without any kind of dependence or contingency whatsoever. So as one goes through these teachings, we have to be aware of the kind of different levels of subtlety to the selflessness or empty. So then, in brief, we have those kinds of outsider schools, and within Buddhists, there are various different philosophical schools, like the Vaibhashikas and Sutra school, and mind only, and so forth. But we can generally characterize into two classes of those that are realists, those that say that things are truly existent as they appear to us, or they're ultimately established, ultimately existent. Schools like the Vaibhashikas and so forth. And then there are the Madhyamakas, or the proponents of the middle way, following after Nagarjuna and so forth. They interpret the Buddha's teachings to say that there is no ultimate existence, no true existence. So this is the first kind of main division. So then the Madhyamaka kind of view gets elaborated on or sort of distinguished when Tibetan masters look at this kind of different ways of understanding this. So we'll get into the kind of differences here, but each puts forth their own sort of understanding. When we take, for example, the self, and the self is designated on the basis of these aggregates, our form and our feelings, compositional factors, consciousness, and discrimination. And so it isn't something, although it doesn't appear to us as though it is merely designated by mind, but it appears to exist from its own side, as though it had some kind of existence in its own right. Like when we see something that is a pleasant form, we think that it is pleasant or attractive from its own side. Or when we have an enemy that we view with animosity, we think that they are that way, that bad from their own side, established from their own kind of being. And so whether it's sort of us as individuals or looking at other kinds of objects, we exaggerate, we superimpose a kind of reality as though things existed from their own side, when it doesn't actually exist in that way. So here, when we see teachings like, for example, in the Heart Sutra, where it talks about no form, no feelings, no discrimination, no compositional factors, and so forth, this is getting at the fact that things appear to us. It's not negating their very appearance, but they don't actually exist in the way that they appear. They appear to have some sort of autonomous existence, not depending upon anything else, not depending or being contingent on anything. Whereas in reality, these are only things that come about due to the aggregation of various causes and conditions. And so here, again, we can see the way that things appear to us, like our enemy or something appears as though they exist that way from their own side, independent of any of our kind of thinking. But when we actually try to examine, we can't find something that we can point to. So here, when one on the one side, we need to begin by looking for the self. We designate this I, this self, on the basis of designation of these five aggregates. But if we actually begin to the process of sort of searching for that thing within its basis of designation, we can't point to our form as being the self. The kind of karma that we have created, our intended karma, that too is not the self. When we look at our various feelings, our neutral or pleasant, unpleasant feelings, none of those can be identified as the self. So too, when we look at like our 6 different consciousnesses for the aggregate of consciousness, we can't point to and find something that is the self, or that kind of discrimination, that the sort of faculty that allows us to distinguish and determine things, that too we can't point to and say that is the self. So we have this aggregation of all of these various factors, and on the basis of that, we can posit an individual. We can say like, oh yeah, there's Tashi, there's Tundrup, and so forth. But when we try to search for that I, that self, as it appears to us, we can't actually find it. And so too, when it comes to something like production, is production something where it is arisen from itself? Is it arisen from an intrinsically existent other? Are things arisen from self and other, or do they come about causelessly? Now we can see that things appear, they arise, but when we search for those things as they appear, we can't actually find anything that we can point to. So too, when it comes, whether it's looking for ourself, for other sort of object, for something like production, and we try to pin down or point to, find that thing that is production, we can't actually find it. So it is then by this kind of meditation on emptiness, this coming to understand how things lack that sort of existence in the way that they appear to us, that we can come to see how they are illusion-like. They arise, they appear, but they don't actually exist in the way that they appear to us. So, here, then, if again, when you are using this kind of reasoning to investigate investigate and analyze phenomena, one comes to see that they are empty. When one is examining and searching for that kind of ultimate nature of phenomena, it is seen that they don't actually exist as they appear. There's no sort of ultimate nature to be found. But then the question might arise: well, then, what is the sort sort of object of a valid cognition? Is conventional existence valid? Now, there are some who see things like the quotation from the King of Concentration Sutras, where it says, the eye, ear, and nose consciousnesses are not valid knowledge. The tongue, body, and mental consciousnesses are also not valid knowledge. If these sense consciousnesses were valid knowledge, of what use to anyone would be the Arya's path? So here, this kind of leads certain people to think that the intention here is to negate everything, to negate even the kind of form itself. And so this is, again, if things existed in the way that they appeared, as though they had this kind of true existence and they actually existed in that way, there would be no purpose to developing this kind of wisdom of realizing emptiness, of an Arya's meditative equipoise. And so it is in the context of that meditative equipoise that one realizes the lack of existence of phenomena. But here, this kind of individual takes this extension of the negation too far in that they think that form itself, form too, doesn't exist at all. And so this kind of refutation overdoes this sort of understanding. So here we will get next time into more of what these sort of two different understandings of the middle way are. But here one can be a kind of overextension of the negation of things, thinking that because phenomena don't truly exist, that they don't sort of exist at all, and thereby they refute even their conventional existence. So then the other way of understanding follows after, like Lama Tsongkhapa following after Nagarjuna and so forth, wherein they assert that these dependently originated phenomena, although they don't have any kind of existence from their own side, they exist as mere dependent originations. Although nothing can be found to point to this is the thing when it is searched for, this doesn't negate their existence altogether. So here, based upon this kind of understanding, one can see that there is no existence of form and so forth from their own sides in this way that is able to bear analysis, but they exist as mere dependent originations. And it is within that context that one can tentatively posit all functionality, all actions and agents are suitable to function within that level of existence. So here we will get into this more in a future class.